Good morning, everyone. I hope you had a fantastic Thanksgiving. Um, I've heard from many of you on how your microchurches are going, as well as some of the activities you've been doing. Some of you guys have gone hiking together. Others have had Thanksgiving with each other. Some of you guys have just been talking and sharing in chores and raking leaves, although I'm not sure that's fun, but there you go. So thanks for sharing those things. Um, I love hearing those stories about what God is doing, and so I really appreciate you just communicating those to me. Many of you have asked how Kristen and I are doing. We have made the move to South Dakota. It is a different culture and a different climate here. Um, but we are slowly getting adjusted to it. We've been here a little over a week now, and um, we are getting things unpacked. The house is slowly coming into order. We're finding things we both need, as well as things that we packed that we realize we probably don't need anymore. And so that's always fun. So, um, I just sort of want to take a moment here. Today's going to be a little bit different. For the next 4 weeks, we're going to go through a different format and see how it goes. For this Advent season, which is a season that starts today in the church, rather than using the Verbella platform to share a message from a local church, we're going to transition that time to more of a discussion time to talk about how to lead your microchurch. So Sunday nights at 10 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 11 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. Um, that's when we're going to be in Verbella. And again, to get there, you just go to log into Verbella, go to the soccer field, go to building 13, and we're right in there. And so you'll be able to see us there. We also have been asked to consider expanding that to Roblox, and so uh, I'm still playing with that, trying to see if I want to do that or not. So we may do that. If we do, I'll let you know when that happens as well. I'm still going to refer you to a local church because I think it's important for us to stay connected to a local church in some way. And you can go to this church, or if there's a church in your area, if you want to find a church in your area, let me know. I can maybe provide some direction as to a place where you can sort of connect with online. But for the next couple of weeks for the Advent season, particularly, I'm going to just sort of refer us to Pastor Mike Klein's church in Mountain View Church in Almsville, Oregon. Pastor Mike's doing a series I'll probably follow along with, and Pastor Mike does a great job. So if you're needing more of a traditional framework, so worship setting and whatnot, um, I think that Almsville will do a great job. So we'll go there, right? Additionally, though, I've had a lot of people asking if I'd just be willing to preach every week, and so we're gonna try that for this Advent series, for this Advent season. I'll preach an Advent message series, and that's what we're gonna do right now. So let's sort of get started on this conversation here. Today, as I said earlier, we start the season of Advent. And so for the next 4 weeks, we're going to be celebrating the coming of Jesus as an infant child, right? But Advent is also when we look expectantly to the second coming of Jesus. And so Advent is a celebration of both the original coming of Jesus as an infant and also the second coming of Jesus. The problem is oftentimes we forget about the second coming of Jesus because during Advent season, it's close to Christmas time. And when you start thinking about Christmas, you start thinking about, the little baby Jesus and the manger and this traditional nativity story. We like to think of gentle wise men bringing gifts of, and we like to think of cows and sheep and donkeys and goats and chickens sort of milling around. Um, we like to think of that, and we know that even though historians may think that the stable may have been a cave or maybe even a large room underneath a family sleeping quarters, we know that historians talk about that, but really we don't care about that. All we really care about is the idea of this baby Jesus sort of being bathed in soft, warm candlelit, and angels singing him lullabies. So, um, uh, That's what we sort of think of. But really, if we really think about this, to think about the traditional service, the traditional story, that's sort of a disservice to this season. Because what it does is it sort of trivializes the significance of the coming of Jesus. And make no mistake, we just can't afford to trivialize God's arrival. And we can't afford to forget what has actually happened. We can't forget that Jesus both came and is coming. And so we have to be ready and waiting with high expectations. And so this year, our Advent series, what I'm going to preach on is called The Christmas Dragon. And it's sort of a strange title, but it'll make sense in a few minutes. I promise you that. You see, um, what many of us have forgotten is that there's actually three distinct narratives of Jesus' coming to Earth. Those narratives are the traditional historical narrative, right? But there's also a spiritual narrative, and then there's a personal narrative. And each of these elements, each of these narratives are significant for you and I to understand. Because these narratives sort of help us understand both how Jesus came and how he will come, and they provide us with a broader perspective than our tradition uh, allows. So, I want to set the foundation for these three narratives with this passage here. The foundation is found in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. And basically, here's what it says: In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And so we have this passage here. Um, and basically, what it's telling us is that in the beginning, meaning before the New Testament, before the Old Testament, before the kings, before Exodus, before the flood, before the creation story, before the formation of the world, in the very beginning, the Word, Jesus, already existed. It's important for you and I to recognize that Jesus was always there, that Jesus is not an afterthought. He's not someone randomly chosen to be God's son. He's not a prophet. He's not simply a good teacher. Jesus was and is and always will be. Before the beginning, it was always Jesus. When it is all said and done, it will be Jesus. So before we even talk about the distinctiveness of these three narratives, it's important for you and I to understand that Jesus was always part of the narrative here. And we should never forget that, right? So um, we have the foundation of all three narratives being built on Jesus. And so let's start digging into what these three narratives are. The first one is the one that we're most familiar with, the traditional historical narrative. We find that story in Luke 2, 1 through 5. Basically, it tells a story of how the Roman Empire Augustus decreed a census should be taken, um, and everyone had to return to their ancestral homes to register for the census. Because Joseph was a king, a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, because Bethlehem was King David's ancient home. So he traveled there from Nazareth, um, and he took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was expecting a child. So these are familiar elements. We know this. We know that there's a census. We know there's a pregnant Mary traveling with Joseph to Bethlehem. We know that there's a charged political climate because uh, people had to register at their ancestral homes. We know that a descendant of great king was now engaged to a woman who was carrying another person's child. We know all the hardship of travel, the frustration of the political climate. We know that shame of the discovery of the illegitimate child. And this is that opening scene of the traditional historical narrative. Um, so as we talk about the rest of the other narratives here, hold on to the emotional stress and the tension of that opening scene. We sort of get the political, the frustration of political climate, right? So that's relevant right now. Many of us understand the hardship of travel. Um, we also, some of us may understand the shame of the discovery of something that we don't want others to realize, right? So hold on to that tension, that emotional stress, and then let's sort of switch over to the spiritual narrative. So the second narrative is a spiritual narrative. It's found in Revelation 12. And candidly, many people don't think of Revelation as part of the nativity story, the traditional Advent story. It gets missed, but my contention is it's significantly important because we know this in Ephesians 6:12 tells us that we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against mighty powers in this dark world, and against evil spirits in the heavenly places. And make no mistake, we are in a battle not just for our souls, but also for the souls of those around us. And the problem is, this is really not a fair fight for you and I. You know, and here's what I mean when I say that. I guess if we could see the people we were fighting against, we would sort of know how to fight. Like we could analyze their tactics, we could sort of determine what's going to happen next, what we need to do. We could come up with a strategy and create logistics to sort of make sure that everything is well supplied so that we can fight this enemy. But the enemy that is against us can't be seen in this world. Our enemy can only be seen in the spiritual realm, and you and I have no physical power there. We have no power in that spiritual realm. So, what we can see, though, is a manifestation of the spiritual battle being played out in our culture and the lives of those who we love. Now, we call that manifestation of the spiritual battle. We call that addiction or infidelity or cruelty or apathy or obsession. But those are all conditions that come as a result of the spiritual battle. And our only hope to win that battle, because we have no power there, is to be dependent on Jesus, who has power both in the physical and in the spiritual realms. But let's be clear, Jesus was not immune to this spiritual battle either. He was deeply affected by it. And we get a picture of the battle that's taking place in the spiritual realm as John introduces us to the spiritual narrative in Revelation chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. And here's what he says there. Then I witnessed in heaven an event of great significance. I saw a woman clothed with her sun, with the moon beneath her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She is pregnant, and she cried out because of her labor pains and the agony of giving birth. Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, with 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of the sky, and he threw them to the earth. He stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth, ready to devour her baby as soon as it was born. So, um, there's a lot of stuff in Revelation 12, 1 through 4 that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? But these are basically the elements that are play in the spiritual narrative. There's two events of great significance. The first is a woman in labor. The second is a large red dragon. The first event of great significance is the expected birth of a child. So this woman pregnant is experiencing all the pain, now, the anguish of childbirth. She's clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet, and has a crown of 12 stars on her head. So, um, we're going to pause and try to identify this woman. The sun and the moon are both celestial objects that give light. Without both, the world would be completely dark, right? Therefore, this woman's role is to bring light into a dark world. I believe this woman is to be representative of the nation of Israel, and the crown of 12 stars to represent the 12 tribes of Israel, right? You can probably go deeper into that, but that's just sort of a surface analysis on that. The second great event of great significance is the appearance of the red dragon. Now, we don't live in a time where we understand the concept of dragons except in like fantasy. So we sort of have to rely on John's description. Um, and he describes this dragon as a large red male dragon with 7 heads, with crowns on them and 10 horns. We know this dragon is clearly bent on destruction. His tail swept away 1/3 of the stars from the sky and throws them to earth. We know that he is waiting to devour the woman's baby as soon as it's born. And I know that this is a spiritual narrative. I know it's difficult to sort of, identify things well, but let's try to identify this dragon in this. Um, and again, I want to be clear. I don't want to try to get too deep into this prophetic vision. And if that's something you want to do, feel free to go ahead and do it. But for us, I believe that the clues as to who the dragon is are that there's a third of the stars being thrown down to earth and being the enemy of the woman. So if the woman is Israel, then the enemy of Israel, this large red dragon, must be Satan. The stars then must represent the angels who chose to follow Satan, um, and how they were cast out of heaven and brought down to earth. So that's, again, not getting too deep, just surface level analysis of it, just things that sort of make sense as we read it. This sets the tone for the spiritual narrative. Um, Satan held his destructive power against Israel's purpose of being light into the world, good versus evil, and that is just as real as the traditional historical narrative that we are so familiar with. So we have the first two narratives: the traditional historical narrative uh, of baby Jesus being born in a manger, in nativity, and the second narrative of the spiritual narrative of this woman giving birth in this red dragon trying to devour that child. The third narrative, though, that we must be aware of is the personal narrative. And this is significant because the personal narrative is lived out every day in our lives. The personal narrative tells everyone around us that if we believe that the historical traditional narrative exists, and we believe that the spiritual narrative exists, then the personal narrative also exists, and that personal narrative defines how we live out God's love for us, how we live out not God's love for us, but also how we live out God's love for others as well. So Paul writes a little bit about this personal narrative in Romans 8:38 through 39. He says, "And I'm not convinced that nothing can separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, neither angels or demons, neither our fears for today nor our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. No power in the sky above or in the earth below. Indeed, nothing in all of creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus our Lord." See, it's in the personal narrative that we find our hope for God's love in our lives. And hope is this critical element in the personal narrative because it tells us that our hope is not in vain. It tells us that because Jesus has already come, we can have hope. And so when we look at the historical traditional narrative and we try to understand the spiritual narrative, we also have to apply we have to be able to recognize that we can live victorious because of the personal narrative that we have of hope. So First Peter tells us that our hope is a living hope; it's constantly being renewed, and our hope is renewed that when we our hope is renewed when we recognize our fears and embrace a full dependency on God. Our hope is renewed when we step out in faith because of what God has done for us. Our hope is renewed when we reject those things that bring shame into our lives. And our hope is renewed when we embrace God's full grace in our lives, full and unearned grace in our lives. So, this Advent season, as we start this message for today, this Advent season is when we celebrate the coming of Jesus, both to redeem us and to restore us, right? And we don't we celebrate both when He came first as an infant child to redeem and restore us, but also when he comes, his second coming, when he comes to redeem and restore us again. The hope we carry through this season is representative of the victories we acknowledge both historically, both spiritually, and personally. So, with that said, take some time and process how is your hope this season? What does that look like? And how does this play out for you? Again, thanks for taking the time to sort of listen to this. We'll talk a little bit more how you would teach this tonight in the Verbella platform. Looking forward to seeing you guys there and have a great day today.